Thank you all for coming. Um, I know this is probably a weird talk at a tech conference because it's sort of like about sales and not specific technology. But given that shops are essentially service businesses, professional service businesses, we're subject to this very pervasive business problem across all businesses that do services. And it's from my experience running a dev shop that has led to just like a lot of thinking about like how do you deal with this sort of age-old feast and famine problems. Everybody have experience with that in some form. Can we just do a little, since we're a small group, just do like a quick, hey, how are you? Just do a quick, if you can grab one of those worksheets, there's not one for every seat, but yeah, thank you. Just say a show of hands, like who here is a freelancer, more or less. Who here manages a team? Who here works on a team but doesn't manage a team? What else? I think maybe you didn't raise your hand for anything. What can I?
I did the last ones first. Working on a team.
Working on a team. Oh, okay, sorry. Cool. So there's different lenses on this problem, right? Like if you're a freelancer, you're basically like subject to the whole problem, and if you're managing a team, you're kind of looking at it from like a more than one person perspective. But that's the feast and so we're just going to look at the feast and famine problem and kind of walk through like the sort of from foundations how we get to the problem and like how we might look at tackling the problem using really kind of starting with some really basic geometry and some basic arithmetic and kind of working up to like different ways of thinking about it. So we're all starting off in our businesses either as freelancers or as larger teams, and we're ready for business. And we're getting business. It's very exciting. We're doing work. Things are trucking along, and you do good work, and there leads to more work, and all of a sudden, great, more work. And how are we going to get all that done? And then you realize, oh, it's not even that simple. It's also like work of different kinds. That's what really kills us, right? Like, it's bad enough if you were just like cranking out widgets. But if you're also cranking out like 16 kinds of widgets, then it gets really weird. So what do? We go to Google. And we put these words together from some vague conversations we might have had with some MBA uncle or something. And, oh yeah, there's this thing called resource management. Great, how do you do that? And you look, and then you find something great. And it's this PDF. And you discover this really weird bunch of words. And it turns out there's this whole field in computer science called the Resource-Constrained Project Scheduling Problem, which has the catchy acronym RCPSP, which I've had to train myself to not get backwards like 100 times. I still can't do it. And they're, okay, great, this is a solved problem, must be. There's all this technical stuff. And then you start reading and you look and you get to this part. And you're like, oh, wait a second. Wait, is this really is it that hard? Is this that complicated? It turns out it's that complicated. Now, this isn't exactly our problem. Feast and famine is a little bit of a watered down concept compared to this. What these guys are solving in computer science is a little bit more formally defined as like it's like a workflow problem, optimization problem. And it's a scheduling problem where you have many moving parts and constrained resources. So what we're dealing with in small businesses or medium-sized businesses, service businesses, is really kind of in the broadest sense related to this. But really, like, this is probably not our answer for the moment. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to do what 30 years of RCPSP has just sort of, the best they can do is approximation algorithms. We're going to like pretty much do the same right here in the course of 15 minutes. It's going to be awesome. All right, so what I want you to do, and I'm hoping you guys are all like ready for this because I know it's like snowy Sunday and your coffee probably hasn't sunk in, but let's try. So what I want you to do is just think about your team, and that could be just you if you're a freelancer, it could be a larger team that you're managing, or if you're working on a team but not managing it, just sort of imagine you were managing it or something like that. So just imagine your team, and then just think about like, just if you haven't thought about it, because it surprised me how long it's taken me to think about it, even running a business, what is our capacity? And let's just think about it. How would you calculate that? I mean, just any suggestions?
What we usually do is figure out how many hours I have available per team member.
Right.
And I kind of have some calculus about stuff, how much time they can spend literally doing billable work versus doing all the
Great.
other crap.
Wow, you're ahead of where I was, that's for
sorry.
sure. No, I mean, I think I'm still trying to figure that out. Billable, right? Because billable, certainly important, but how many hours do we, what do our contracts say mostly? You come in 40 hours a week.
Right.
How much of that is billable?
Well, that's the big question.
There's the rub, right? But let's just start somewhere. So let's just maybe pick a team size, pick your own team size, but I'm just going to put down like, I'm just going to keep it simple for myself because I can't think that much, but I'm just going to say 40 hours, or maybe I'll make it a little more interesting. I'll say I'm 2 people at 40 hours. So 40 times 2, 80 hours, and times, let's just keep it simple, times 4 weeks is 160 hours a week. Okay, great. So there's a number. Now, as you said, like, billable is different. Do you know what your billable utilization, so to speak, is? Like, if you had to guess?
We try to target 32 out of 40 hours a week.
Yeah.
Like 80-ish%. That's, and how often do you hit that? No, you don't want to know. No one wants to know. We don't want to know. Turns out.
You do it like per type of employee, so like
Right.
basically owners are at about 50%
Oh, true, yeah, it's different
billable,
for-
and then we take employees and go closer to 80.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. If
So.
you manage a team, you can't be billable all the time.
Yeah, it's like blended.
So it definitely varies by job description to some degree, or sort of manager, non-manager. But we've found is also really matters like what specifically what you're doing. Like designers have a different utilization level versus project managers versus coders. So turns out it's really tricky, and so you could potentially kind of blend everything. But anyway, this is really just a thought exercise to just start to think through how you would tackle this. And then let's think about the next thing. So how many project hours or whatever units you're using, just to say if it's billable hours, how many hours are in your pipeline? How would we think about that? It's hard. Turns out it's really hard. Like, certainly not off the top of our heads, but theoretically it shouldn't be that hard. This is really, we're still at basic arithmetic,
We're
right?
talking about work that has been signed and
Signed or not signed?
Yeah, calculate that.
whole total pipeline, huh?
It's tricky.
We add in the complexity of whether it's a flat rate project or if we're doing time and materials too.
Yep, that's another kink. Contract duration. Sometimes you'll have contracts that are maintenance and support, and they'll renew automatically, but not totally automatically. Like there's still a confidence level on like, is that going to renew? So I'm just going to put like, I don't know for that one. And then how much of this capacity is in play in 3 months from now? So your capacity. So now it's a question of like, is your capacity static? Which in many businesses it's reasonably stable, but in faster growing businesses it's less stable, or in contracting businesses it's less stable. Or there's a different mixture between full-time staff and contract staff, that ratio, or flex time versus fixed time. So these are, again, I'm not expecting us to answer these questions. But this is something that's worth thinking about, because we're going to do a little bit more on this in a few minutes, is your team, or if you're a freelancer, your own, just starting to think about like what your roles are. Like, what are the hats that you wear? And the hats that you wear as a freelancer are sort of a microcosm of like the sort of business processes and broader skill sets in a larger organization. So just let's take a second for ourselves just to jot down some roles in your own business, in your own line of work. I'm just going to do my own. Hey, no, do you want one of these, or is extra?
Oh, is there a worksheet?
Sure is.
Ooh, I'll take one too if you have
Oh
another.
yeah, sure. There's more.
So I get for being
We're running out, but
Thanks, Chris.
and I'll give you some colored pencils. Right. We're kind of running on. Oh, I got markers. You guys got lucky.
Ooh, see?
Oh, like
Good
this.
feeling. All right, thank you.
I want all these pencils and markers back.
Oh, no, you're nice.
This is not swag. These are my kids' markers that I stole. So yeah, just jot a few down. Hopefully it's not too many. That's always scary if it's too many. Okay, so let's see. So let's go. Let's see. We've done some of this. So what we're doing now is sort of sizing up our capacity, our muscle. I actually put this online if anybody wants it for whatever reason. And then, oops, sorry. What's you or your team's total capacity for the next month? Tricky to figure out. And then roles. And then yeah. So can somebody just volunteer? Like, what are your roles in your?
User experience designer
Mm-hmm.
and project manager.
Okay, cool. And what about billing?
Billing kind of depends on the company, but I think usually it's the full 40 hours a week, and then over the course of a year.
No, I mean like who takes care of like invoicing and stuff like that?
Well, then there'd be an account manager as well.
That you have?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And then, do you guys do development too,
Yeah.
of various kinds?
Yeah. So front-end developers,
Front-end developers?
solution architects,
Yep.
and business analysts.
Right. So those are all potentially roles that could theoretically have their own dedicated individuals. Maybe there's some folks that do both. But that's like the essential thing in this whole exercise, because ultimately it's those roles that are going to bridge your incoming work, your pipeline, to what your staffing is. So that's where the articulation of these things is really important. And so let's see. Now that we've sort of put a little bit of thought into it, so one approach we could try to tackling this is let's just plot some circles. Maybe it's worth it because we don't have our actual project data in front of us and our pipeline data in front of us. But just like maybe let's imagine a few projects. There's no scale. There's no scale on this chart. So if you're looking here, you might just for simplicity, or just to kind of get the scale roughly in the right ballpark, you might put like 100 hours up here on this axis right here. And then time, there's no scale there either, but we can just think of this as whatever really makes sense to you. Like there's going to be businesses that are like turning around projects really quickly. In my world, in our world, I think it's more common that projects are like on the 2 to 4 month scale, and then they sort of move into a new phase. And phasing is its own kind of subject in itself, because whether you define a project as multi-phase and multi-contract versus single is another nuance. But just for simplicity, like one way we could solve this is just by throwing some circles on the chart, and then, you know, with some thought, putting like relative scales on them. And then that's like kind of a quickie way to do this. And then the question is, does it yield anything useful? And the problem is it probably doesn't. It's hard to kind of add that up, really, without getting into some really weird geometry. So let's just think about another way, which would be, let's just try squares, because at least squares, in the case of squares, you can plot the scale, the vertical scale, and you know, you can have big projects that are short, and then big projects that are long. And depending on how those play out, you can start to build a kind of stacked model of what your capacity looks like. And now you can actually start taking measurements, right? You can start looking at, like up here, depending on what your scale is, you're saying, okay, at this point, we're, you know, we're in business, and things are maybe, depending on what your staff is, it's either slow or you're either really busy or really not busy. But then it jumps up to here, and this is actually a pretty scary chart. Like if this is your business, again, depending significantly on the scales, you're potentially needing to dramatically hire in almost no time, and then dramatically fire in almost the same amount of time. This is a bad situation. But still, at least we're getting somewhere in terms of mapping these things out. This is just sort of like accentuating how, you know, usually your capacity is relatively stable, but if your projects are going up and down like this, you're going to have some problems. So let's just kind of keep that in the back of our mind, because, as I said, like these projects are not monolithic blocks, right? They're different processes kicking in at different times. And so remember those different colors. Those are really important. As you were saying, like your utilization varies dramatically by the role. Within different skill sets, different pieces happen at different times. So this way of modeling a project as a block, which is actually fairly common, like if you're thinking in most sort of scheduling systems, you're more or less moving blocks around. So we're getting somewhere, but we're still like kind of in potentially not giving ourselves anything that meaningful. And so let's just for a second zoom in on a single project, okay? And so I think, is anybody here not in web development of some form? I assume everybody here is. Okay, great. But you know, within web development, of course, there's really different approaches. So maybe, does anybody feel brave enough to volunteer, like just at an outline level, like what your sort of idealized project timeline might look like in terms of roles? Maybe, do you mind if I keep picking on you, because we already have like a vocabulary there? So, so if we were to, I'm just going to actually like use this and draw up here so we can all see. So what were the roles you mentioned?
Business analyst.
Business analyst. Okay. What was the other one?
UX consultant.
UX.
Project manager.
PM. Front-end developer. Back-end developer.
Back-end.
Do you guys have a dedicated QA team or person? You do.
System testing. Yeah,
QA. You gotta love when you misspell QA. Okay, so what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we're gonna just sort of ignore administration, just because I don't know why. Too complicated. That's really complicated. So great. So those are our roles, and then on this timeline that is sort of at the bottom of your page, what I'm hoping we can do is just start to imagine like these different roles, and like if we were to like even either whether it's in squares or in circles, just go back to like thinking about, let's say we have a project that starts here and your deadline, so to speak, like the contract is promising here. Again, it doesn't really matter what the scale is. Let's just start to think about where do these processes go do they all go the whole duration at the same level? If it did look like that, if that were the case, just to prove the extreme, this is what it would look like. And blocks would be perfect. But that's not how it works, right? So it's kind of just stating the obvious, that doesn't really work. So now, let's just think about business analysts. When do they engage? And
They're usually the first.
the first, okay. And then, let's see, how am I going to do this? Like maybe roughly how long along that timeline do
So let's say,
they pinch out,
let's
or
say about 2/3, and then they'd probably start tapering down.
they start
Maybe-
tapering?
Maybe,
Okay.
maybe a third or half, and then they'd
So
start
maybe like something like that.
Yeah.
All right, cool. And then UX, when do they happen?
Probably a little bit. They're probably coming a little bit after. Probably too late.
Too late. All right. Well, let's fix that. Let's make them start right on kickoff,
Okay.
just for fun.
Okay.
So they start on kickoff, and then what happened? How long do they? They probably end too early. They should probably be really engaged up there. But when do they typically end?
They'll probably stay on a bit longer. Probably similar to the BAs.
Right. So maybe like just sort of like this. And then project manager.
That's probably pretty flat.
Yep. That's my experience too. Maybe there's a little bit of ebb and flow, but front end developer,
Coming, yeah.
somewhere in there. And then do they usually go to the end, or there's kind of a handoff?
I think they'll go pretty close to the end.
Pretty close to the end. Actually, I set this volume, so to speak, that's the same as your business analyst, but like if we were to look at their hours,
Yeah.
it's probably
Be a
like,
bigger team.
right, that's probably went off by like an order of magnitude. So let's just make that bigger. And then back end,
Probably closer to the start.
close to the start.
Yeah.
Oh.
Smaller team as well.
Right.
I
Makes
know.
sense. Is that true for everyone? Or well, I'll ask that in a second. Say like, you need some kind of specs, so maybe like out here somewhere. Right. Okay. And then something like
Smaller team, I'd say.
smaller. Right. Smaller team. Let's just say something like that. And then QA somewhere out here. Yeah. Probably. Again, starting like ideally QA starting early, but okay. Cool. So wow, I made them pretty with curves, but I could draw this without curves, more like a step fashion. This is your PM, and then your business analyst might look like this, just to keep consistent with our block model, and your UX guy might look like this, and then your front end might look like this, just to keep it simple, and back end might look like this, and QA might look like this, say, just for, So that would be like if we didn't start making things weird with curves, but the idea of ramp up is pretty useful. So we've done our roles. We sort of size up the project. Again, we haven't put scales on anything. Like, I'm not going to ask you like what you guys charge, but like whatever it is, like what you can do now is say, okay, for a budget, let's just say it's like 100 hours. The math for this is actually pretty straightforward, right? We can just use pretty much linear proportions to figure out how to split this up. And let's see. And so that's what I was just saying, allocate the budget. And just how the budget gets spent over time is basically what we're looking at here. We're now looking at kind of like a model for a project. And so here's where it gets really interesting, because whereas before, let me just go back to this screen for a second. So in this case, we're looking at different projects, but each one of these projects really looks like that, right? So the math has not been too tricky yet. Is everybody with me? Is this like making sense? More or less? Okay. The math hasn't been too tricky in theory. Like if whatever this number is, you can sort of see like this is your capacity, these are your project sizes. But now when we add, even forgetting this, if we're to take this and put it over here, Well, now it's really kind of tricky, right? Because it's not that tricky. The math isn't technically that tricky, but it's starting to go beyond where we can do this in our heads, right? So that's what's leading to the next idea, which is to try to just stack these. And if you were to try to stack these, it turns out there's a lot of math, it turns out. And this is really like just further down in that paper. But just looking at from an arithmetic perspective, this is like essentially like a graphical way of taking these kinds of things, storing the math in the background, and then ideally you're splitting up your stack by roles. So now in this particular case, this is live data, so to speak, from my business, my development business. And this is our small Drupal team, and here is their work and their capacity, and the story here is now pretty clear in terms of like, yeah, we could probably use more work depending on what your utilization criteria is, right? If you're trying to hit 80%, we're below 80%, but it doesn't necessarily need to be 80%, because when you start doing the math, you realize, okay, depending on your rate, your bill rate, and this and that and the other thing, this is actually pretty comfortable. So that's sort of the gist of it, and I wanted to just share with you some additional background material. There's a spreadsheet that you can use that does a really good job of the app that we're doing, just in a lower key way. It can be like a nice way to just sort of like take some of the ideas that we've been playing with here, just in thought exercise mode, and just plot some data in a spreadsheet, gather your data in a spreadsheet, and just generate some curves. That crazy article, it's actually not, it looks worse than it is. It's worth kind of reading just because it's interesting, and a lot of the materials just starts to make sense. And then this app that I just showed you is like something that we're in beta on. We're testing out with a couple different customers and eagerly getting feedback to try to get the information here being as relevant as we can to helping helping companies figure out how to scale and do and basically match your pipeline, which is, this is your pipeline on the right, to your staffing. Just a couple other comments on this. Like you see, there's a gray line there. That gray line represents essentially all of these projects in here have a confidence level, because we don't know, right? Like, does anybody here use a CRM? You use a CRM? So from CRMs, like whenever you put a project in, most of them at least, let you put a confidence. Like, is it a hot lead? Is it a warm lead? Is it a cold lead? The idea with this is you don't want to ignore any of them, but you want to scale them appropriately. You don't want to like hire on your best case scenario, because that may not be realistic. So basically, that gray area is like the best case scenario where everything comes through. In which case you better be careful and ideally give yourself enough lead time to do the hiring if you're really going to take on that much work. Because taking on that much work can end up really, sounds good, more business, and then all of a sudden your deliverables are starting to get a little like shaky, because like all of a sudden people are juggling too much. So yeah, that's the general idea. I mean, I can keep going on some other ideas related to a concept called productization. Has anybody heard that term, or productization of services? Have you heard that term? Are you guys attempting that?
It's actually something we're talking more about than doing, but I'd love to hear more your take on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pattern that we're seeing, and it's relevant for the software because, as neat as this is to like design curves and plot stuff, it still takes some mental effort. And not only that, because it doesn't take that much mental effort, it's relatively easy to do this, but it sort of misses the point in the sense that, like, ideally you're not inventing a new production line every time you take on a new project. And so systematizing and templatizing your business process is really kind of what is ideal, and it's becoming like a big trend in professional services. And so what it means for, like, one of the companies we're talking to right now is 6 Point Creative. Has anybody heard of them? It's a really nice design agency down in Springfield. They have like 25 business process templates or productized services, which is amazing. And they range from like tiny, like 6-hour projects to like 50-hour projects. But ideally, ideally they might reduce that number. But it's like an interesting approach, because rather than just doing everything with kind of like a bespoke mindset, we'll solve any problem, we'll tackle anything. That's true. Like, it keeps it interesting, but it makes it pretty hard to like kind of regularize your business. And so that's a concept that's starting to emerge just like in conversation, and then it manifests here as like essentially like saving these things as templates, which is like a feature that we just implemented. And what that theoretically does is it allows a business process pipeline that goes from your CRM to, well, which flavor project is this? Let's not reinvent it. Let's try to achieve this as part of our targets related to utilization or hiring or just staying sane.
And what's your process for building out these products, or what are your thoughts on that? Is it like take a project you've already done and sort of retrofit it and make it more vanilla so it's reusable, or is it to try to build a vanilla project first and then apply it to incoming work?
I do not know the answer to that. It really varies. For us at Knectar, the forms that it takes are like, we're templatizing on different levels to some degree, in the form of like building better starter themes. It's not quite templatizing services or productizing services. But there is a way that it's taken form, which is like when we emerged about 4 or 5 years ago with like realizing that like we should be selling maintenance and support packages. That's probably the best example for us. Beyond that, it does get tricky. On the other hand, it's kind of useful for us to have this sort of model in our heads, and as part of our proposals.
Yes, that's a huge place for us too.
Yeah, so as long as we're sort of reinforcing with proposals, ideally that will like lend to more normalization over time. Yeah. Another thing, I kind of hinted at it before, another sort of subject on this whole area is the question of, this is obviously very idealized, kind of what we would call like a primary build. Well, does this work for a post-launch phase 2? No, it doesn't. It doesn't. Should it be built into this model? It's one client. And what I tend to argue, and this is independent of the software, is projectizing. So it's sort of like kind of a cousin of productizing, but projectizing is just something else that we're finding, especially as we talk to like beta customers for this software, and meaning like we're just engaging with lots of agencies that are like have different processes. Where folks, where decision makers decide to projectize really varies. And I formed an opinion on this many years ago when I first heard that word, and I was like, oh my God, that's like the best word ever. Where it's essentially, yeah, sure, it's like phase 2, but it's also just like, it's often the case that we'll get a project that really has genuinely multiple parallel tracks. They're different service teams, they're different skill sets, they're sometimes not even internal. There's dependencies related to like, okay, for that piece, like we're working on a project now for Trillium Beer. Has anybody heard of them? Yeah. And we're speccing it, and they're like, oh, and by the way, there's a Shopify site. And we're like, oh. And I look at it, and it's like just boilerplate. There was not even a theme applied. I'm like, okay, that's just going to stay like, oh, no, we'd love it to look like the web's, okay. So that's that's a good example of like, projectizing is often the saving grace, because it lets you like do this analysis in like a saner way. Like if we were to pack in, oh, and by the way, Shopify into this role model, it's like, maybe it works, but there's maybe a different project manager. There's likely a different set of dependencies. So projectization is another useful thing. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much all I have. I wanted to just get your feedback in terms of like, or just maybe speak to, it's always interesting to me to hear how folks are dealing with this right now. Mostly what we're seeing folks do is work, there are some apps in the marketplace, but for the most part, we're just seeing over and over that people are just hacking their spreadsheets to get this done. How many here have tried to deal with this problem with spreadsheets? Yeah. Yeah. And spreadsheets are like the perfect software because they're just infinitely flexible. But we've seen some incredible spreadsheets too. It's like a cottage industry.
But they're not as highly available or useful, so we ultimately ported it to Forecast,
Right.
which is the harvest.
Yes, Forecast is pretty good.
And it's like the best thing out there.
10,000 feet's
but I
another
don't
one.
love it until I see this, which looks pretty awesome.
It's different. It's different. Like the way we've started to think of, we actually, it's funny. Like at first we were like, oh, we're like competing against Forecast, and then we're like, are
There's
we?
a lot of availability to compete with Forecast.
I mean, and then 10,000 feet is another. It's probably bigger now, especially because it like absorbs more business services than even Forecast. But the more we're talking to folks and seeing the relevance of this approach, we're not actually seeing them as competitors anymore. They will be. We will lose business to those companies, but the reason I don't see it exactly that way is that those are really scheduling tools, whereas this is really a modeling tool, and it's mapping entities in a way that like those tools just they get caught up in the weeds. There's like a tendency to want to build very granular data as your approach to sort of, we just need more data. We just got to pile more OCD into our spreadsheet, and if we just pile more OCD into our spreadsheet, we will get the answer. But it's almost like the exact opposite of what this is. It's like the opposite approach. So what we imagine as we mature as a software is that these kind of print to those scheduling softwares because they're useful. It's like knowing theoretically that's useful.
Yeah, it's still, well, it's still scheduling resources for the most part. You know, we expect you to be, and that's what we use Forecast for. We
Right.
expect you to work 6 hours this week on this project.
Right.
And that's one of the great things we did is took the API because we use Harvest for time
Mhm.
tracking too.
Oh.
So we're actually able to display a dashboard for each of our employees and show
Wait,
how
so
far
you
along are you on.
wait, you use their API to connect their own services?
Yeah, in a way that they don't.
Oh, okay. It's like,
And
wait a second.
Forecast is not, the API is closed, but they were like, well, here you go if you want.
Right.
Yeah, so we sucked out the data, so like essentially.
Would you mind showing us?
Yeah, I got a thing here.
Oh, it's so interesting, like the ways people.
Let's do this.
No, I want to see his way of doing it. It's always
While
fascinating.
he's pulling it up, do you have any experience with like integrating with a time tracking tool like Harvest? Something?
Yeah, we're working on Harvest and what's the other one? Teamwork. Yeah, just because we used Harvest for years and then we actually switched. A lot of folks went the opposite direction, but we decided to bake our time logs into our tasks. So in Teamwork. So that's we'll probably start with. Well, honestly, our first integration is going to be with HubSpot. And then we're going to move back to the time log integrations. But HubSpot is like, there's a lot of business value in connecting with that network. So, and also not just that, but like being able to pull in the CRM data automatically and just assign a template will make the work, that's like kind of where the action starts.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then as we mature and as we get more customers, that's the next thing we'll be tackling is like tying in with time logs, because it'll be really cool to see like, oh, we thought this was a good model. Turns out no.
Well, right, that's super important to us to suss out too, like, we
Right.
make all these estimated proposals and everything, and then we plot it all out, and then was that even on point? Like, you know, where do we?
Right.
Where we miss?
Right, right, and also getting a handle really on what your billable utilization is. It can be shocking, and it's one of the things that, like, for the couple of beta customers that are using it, they're looking and they're like, can this be right? And you start to question, like, where are our assumptions wrong? And you're like, oh, they're not wrong.
Yeah.
We're just, not utilizing that much, as much as we would have liked. We're not even close to 80%. But can you show us? Do you want to show us up here, or we can plug in or whatever?
I don't know if that,
Oh, maybe not.
for capturing the video, but I don't know if this is a good way to do this, but how visible is this? So essentially, this is broken down by each employee, so what we do is take our resources and harvest, but the problem is we don't have that tied to skills. So like in forecast, there's no concept of like skills based. We just have to know that Ruth is a designer and a front end developer, and what does this project take?
Right.
And then we know in harvest, well, Patrick is scheduled to work on X number of this project during this week, and he was scheduled for 4 and he did 1.25, so it kind of flags him as yellow. You didn't quite do enough. Got some bad ones here where scheduled for 4 hours, only did a little bit. And then we have this actually up on a TV that's like refreshing and auto scrolling up. It's like our operations center, and then we can kind of keep our eye on this, and it keeps our employees honest to what we've told them they should do. And we had an intern build this, which is like super, like I can't believe what a useful tool it's been.
Hopefully that intern is now a full-time hire.
That intern was between freshman and sophomore year
Oh my God.
intern. So we got
Nice.
3 years before he comes around, but yeah, he impressed the hell out of me.
UMass student?
But no, UMaine.
Oh, you mean? Cool. Good for him.
Yeah. So that's it, and we just had to take the data out of forecast and then the time entries out of harvest,
Right.
because they don't marry
Which
that
is
information in
still
this way.
mind-blowing to me. Why are you guys not integrating your own services better?
And they will or are,
They will.
but they're
They
just
will.
like,
No, we're-
they're like, here's our API. I mean, at least they took us that far.
We're
So
like,
that's cool, we do all that by hand in spreadsheets, so I love the idea of just, because I didn't know we could get to the API, so that's really cool. And then the one thing we take another step further is we use the Chrome plugin on GitHub to connect our tasks, like any GitHub task, you can turn on the
Yes.
timer and have that logged in harvest, so we have that too, and we're trying to figure out how to pull all that in too.
That's the biggest thing, is like, where do you track it?
Yeah.
And right now, it's all just in harvest.
Yeah, yeah.
And we use Tyga for project issue tracking, which has, I think it can do a timer on it, but then where do you, I don't know. Is everything really a ticket? And it's
Well,
not.
right, I have that
It's like-
argument all the time, like, like, they're like, let's put timers on, let's make tickets for stand-ups, and we'll build time to that, and I'm like, we're going a little far here, but it is a way to capture everything.
so I do want to show one more thing on this, which is that when this is actually the employee screen or the staff resource, whatever, and it basically has multiple roles assumed. That's sort of obviously a test role. In this particular case, this person is doing, this is sort of like a way of setting targets for the different roles, which can vary over time, right? And this propagates, of course, to like the roles that you're applying to projects. And so now by adding up what this person's capacity is, which is 40 hours a week, which you can of course like modify with a buffer to account for like billable, or billable versus, like you can treat this different
Right.
flexibly. Like you can say like, okay, I'm just gonna I know that my, realistically it's gonna be more like 20 or 30%, or
Sure.
or 70 or 80% utilization. So I'm gonna just buffer it that way. And then, for the foreseeable future, this person's primarily a UX designer, but turns out they've got talent with talking to clients and managing, so we'll keep them in mind for that. Or you can change that or have that become a conversation with the employee.
Yeah, do the feature where you can add an individual's rate.
Not yet, no.
Paying them.
We're
That would
keeping
be
money.
helpful to figure out.
out.
I totally agree. We're keeping money out for now, just because there's a lot of mapping logic that goes with it, and then reconciliation, right? As soon as we enter dollars, it now needs to reconcile with QuickBooks, and we're holding off on that. But yeah, I mean, it's probably one of the more popular requests. We'll get there. Noah.
Do you mind building out that project or something like it in Carve, just to show us what that?
Yeah, sure.
You keep saying that it does modeling, and I'm trying to figure out what exactly needs modeling if you're just gonna map those inputs in like that.
Modeling is more or less like just how we're describing this process of drawing. But let's just do that. So let's just call it Noah's project. And then we don't really need to worry about clients for now. And we won't worry about templates. And then let's just call it 300. And then from here, let's just keep the project relatively simple. Let's just say it's a UX designer and a front-end developer. Or maybe we'll throw in a project manager too. And add the project. And what you see at first is basically like this allocation tool. And here's where you will allocate the hours across these different roles. And let's just make it something like that. There's this other way of doing it, which is like where as you scale these things, they all kind of maintain their proportionality. You can lock these different things. So there's some like neat features there, but that's the general idea. And once the budget's allocated, now you're going to plot this in time. And I'm going to change the scale to 6 months. And what you do now is first, I like to start with the project manager first because like we were saying before, they usually span the whole project. So I'll just have them span the duration of the project. Let's say this whole project's not starting until like May or whatever. So I can just bump out all these curves. And then let's just go through that process of thinking that we just did. Let's say the designer starts pretty early, let's say on day 1 even. And again, this will be a simple project, but that goes to roughly midway, and then the development happens, and we're done. That's it. And then what's happening here is now if I assign the project to a person, first of all, I can see who actually has that skill set, which is this fine person called STSDW. What a guy. And then but just basically, I'm assigning it to like my project managers. Those are highlighted rather than, but I can assign it to somebody who's not that primarily. And then I'll just give myself UX, why not? And then...
Is there any indication of like their availability when you're making that choice?
No, but that's in our backlog. Yeah, actually it won't be too tricky. We're just going to add a tooltip to this view, or just a value that just says like utilization for like the current week or the current month. That's like more or less what we're thinking, but we haven't quite nailed that yet.
And then what about things like managing for, and this might be too far beyond, but things like holidays or vacations or people like your whole team goes.
Yes, that's also in the works.
Okay.
It's critical.
Yeah.
In fact, it's like more or less what it will be is comparable to this, because instead of it being a project, it's a person and their roles, just like that other screen.
Yeah.
And this will now be like
Oh, yeah, okay.
this. As you allocate it, the stack will change. It won't be these curves. We're not going to do these curves. It'll just be all flat. And then what you'll do for global holidays or level, they'll just be like a gray, and everyone will get blocked unless they're accepted, because maybe
Or maybe
freelancers.
international or something.
Yeah, exactly. So that's spec. It's not built yet, but and then the other piece will be like adding breaks. So you'll basically be able to like insert a break, or insert like a
Swap.
no, not a swap, a ramp up or ramp down. Like it's like an inflection.
Mhm.
So let's say you have a new hire, but you're not really ready to put them on a project yet. They're going to be in training for like 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years, whatever it takes. That, you know, from here to here might be like 80% training, and then starting here, you're on the clock now. So that is not here yet, but it's probably 2 releases away. Yeah. Yeah, and then so up here just this sort of answers your question a little bit. Like, I'm actually going to jump over to back to here. Like, if I go into this is Knectar. This is my Knectar's account. So if I go here, when I'm looking at this guy and his availability, I'm actually able to see his overall availability right in this context. So like, if I need to make a decision about like, do we need to bump this project out? I'm looking at it in that context. So, you know, in this particular case, like, he looks like he's a little bit too slow right now. It's not, yeah, I actually think I need to update that. But anyway, let me go back to Drupal, and let's look at this guy for a second. So like in this particular case, I can like make adjustments in the context of his overall availability. Or I can just look at a whole list of his projects. And then back here, I can also look at like a bunch of different parameters. Like I can look at like booked work and unbooked work and assigned work and unassigned work, and so forth. So there's a bunch of tools here to help you make decisions about reassignment or stuff like that. Like if I wanted to reassign this, I could also just drag it. That's another way to do it. So you're kind of filling, and the model is that you're kind of like filling these holes visually rather than like spreadsheet, which makes my head hurt imagining trying to do it that way again. Any other comments or thoughts or questions?
This is
Critiques?
slightly off topic, but
I can handle it.
everybody wants to know what is all the technology that you built.
Oh, we built it on the back end's Django API, RESTful API, and then the front end's just React. Nasty React, and D3, and Badger D3. There's a lot of customization to D3. Yeah, and then integrating will be mostly on the back end. Cool. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate you showing up. Yeah, in the snow, no less. In the snow. All right.
Very cool. Thank you.
Yeah. No problem.